yeah, even when it has been well-intentioned, government intervention has almost always further oppressed women.
Hello and welcome to the IEA YouTube channel and happy International Women's Day. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Officer here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I am delighted to be joined by Kat Murti. Kat is the co-founder of Feminists for Liberty, a non-profit that is uplifting libertarian feminist voices and changing the narrative about both feminism and libertarianism. She's also the co-leader of the DC chapter of the Ladies of Liberty Alliance, as well as a communications consultant for the international organisation. Kat serves on the board of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, an international non-profit empowering young people to end the global war on drugs. Today is International Women's Day, a global holiday celebrated annually on the 8th of March, marking a celebration of the women's rights movement. Free markets have enabled women to obtain economic choice and control, empowering us to work, own property, and obtain prosperity, which leads to social freedom. Individual freedom is, of course, women's freedom. So, first of all, Kat, I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about what libertarian feminism means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a libertarian feminist, and it's essentially just a school of feminism. I like to say that feminism is part and parcel of what it means to be a libertarian, right? As you said, if you believe in liberty and self-ownership for everyone, well, women are everyone, right? So libertarian feminists, I guess you would boil down our core beliefs to libertarianism is about applying consent culture to everything. We believe that that equality is not just political and social and cultural equality, but also economic equality for women, economic access, and then and people of all genders. And then finally, there's simply nothing more collectivist than treating individuals as representatives or members of a collective, whether that is as women or as any other demographic quality about them.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. So basically, we look at many of the same issues that feminists might do, but we look at it through a free market, small government, limited government, or no government lens. And part of that is because we look at the long history of oppression and freedom, and we see that, yeah, even when it has been well-intentioned, government intervention has almost always further oppressed women and economic freedom and in cultural change as the way to get there. And that's borne out not just by our ideological views, but by the data, which shows frequently that government interventions do actually make these things worse. So that would be the biggest difference there, where some types of feminists might turn to the government for a solution. We turn to the marketplace of ideas. We turn to better access to economic liberalization and to greater self-ownership.
Fantastic, that's fascinating. And for you personally, or maybe for the wider liberty movement, who do you think were the biggest contributors to the liberty movement? I mean, I can think of a few off the top of my head, Ayn Rand, Emma Goldman, Isabel Patterson, but who for you do you think sort of encompasses this sort of philosophical movement within the liberty movement?
Sure. It's always difficult when you start naming people because you will leave so many people out, as always. I'm actually pleasantly surprised that you mentioned Isabel Patterson. She gets forgotten a lot. Rose Wilder Lane was another contemporary there, very influential in the area. And then, of course, there's from similar periods, there's all sorts of folks from Mary Wollstonecraft to Elizabeth Cady Stanton to Voltairine de Cleyre. There's also both John Stuart Mill and his wife, Harriet Mill. There's also, more modern thinkers along the lines of Joan Kennedy Taylor, Sharon Presley. There's just, at any time that you get into this trap of naming people, I'll just be leaving out so many people. And I think that's part of it. I get the same similar question. Your question's, I think, a much better one, but people will frequently ask me things like, okay, so who are the influential women in the libertarian movement? And if I start naming women, I mean, I don't think I could name all the women that I just interact with on, a day-to-day basis, let alone every woman who's contributed in some way. So I think that we're definitely going to be leaving people out no matter what, but there's just been innumerable contributions in this area where it really is people pushing for greater equality along sex and gender lines and recognizing that oftentimes that means pushing back against oppressive government.
Absolutely, and I think that that's sort of the unifying core principle that all libertarian feminists withhold, and it's this idea that individualism and this belief that the government has the propensity to do more harm than good, especially to women and especially to women's issues. So just on that, I was wondering what you think the biggest sort of issues to tackle are within the libertarian feminist movement, but also just for women in general. What are the biggest sort of current hot topic issues that we should really be fighting for?
Yeah, I think it really depends. Part of this is just where you are in the world, what particular issues might be impacting you now. For a woman who's a woman living in the United States or living in the UK or Australia, is likely going to be facing just a very different world than a woman living in sub-Saharan Africa or in Indonesia, in the Middle East. You just there's not one collective policy that we can all push to or point to. And oftentimes, when we look as libertarians at the top-down nature of government and the failure of command and control, it's because there isn't one right thing that suits every different environment, every different individual. And so while there are specific policies in every area that I think can be targeted, whether in, whether it's something as simple as being treated as an equal citizen in places like the Middle East, to addressing policies that, while textually are sex blind or gender blind in the United States, have a gendered impact, or in many cases were actually created to have a gendered impact, like, for example, the tax code or social security system in the United States. I mean, it's going to vary a lot, but the key is to make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to participate in the political, social, economic systems of the world. And there's different pathways to do that.
Fantastic, that's fascinating. And I mean, the term feminism or feminist, I think, potentially has sort of been co-opted by a lot of these leftist, more authoritarian, more collectivist ideologies. And usually, especially in modern discourse, when you use the word feminist, your automatic sort of perspective is probably going to be that that person is a leftist, or they're more collectivist, or they believe that they want to achieve feminism or gender equality through the apparatus of the state. So what do you think that means in terms of sort of redefining feminism for you? And with libertarian feminism as its own sort of core ideology, how does that sort of look? What is modern libertarian feminism to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, I don't think that it's about redefining feminism. I think that there's always been feminism has ultimately been, and we have to remember, it wasn't even always called feminism. There's been different names for this movement in different places over time, but it's always fundamentally been about pushing back against these sort of command and control notions, oftentimes coming from government, other times coming from government-like structures that force individuals to follow a certain path that may not be where their interests and their comparative advantages lie. Right. And that's something that I think resonates with all of us. But throughout the course of the women's lib or feminist or women's rights or equality movements, or however you wish to term them, there's always been sort of this struggle, this push and pull between those who want to build something for a collective, and not necessarily, and not a voluntary collective, but a state-enforced, oppressive collective, and those who believe in the individual. And these tensions you just see throughout history, throughout all of these movements going back and forth, but there's always been this strong individualist strain. So it's certainly not a new movement by any means. It's been around since very early on, even just within the American context. We can see the first wave of feminism, as is understood within the United States, started at the Seneca Falls Convention in the mid 1800s, where they put out what was called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was basically a document announcing what this new women's movement would be. And so oftentimes when we think back to first wave feminism, people think of it as the suffragettes, and that's probably the most visual cue for you, as this is a first wave feminist issue. And what I find really interesting is that was actually the only resolution that was not voted on unanimously to be included in the Declaration of Sentiments. And partially that was, the only man at the convention. There's 40 men who participated. It was mostly women, but there's 40 men. And the only man who supported and voted for it was Frederick Douglass. So, there's always been this push and pull tension. And there's other movements that were involved along the ways. And so people who viewed it, it came from that we're releasing this today. It's International Women's Day. And International Women's Day has always been closely associated with socialist or communist movements. Well, why is that? If we look at the history, it was essentially a marketing move for the international socialist and communist parties. Socialism originally, it was started on the 1 year anniversary of a labor strike by female factory workers who were fighting for better treatment, better wages. Then in the state of New York, they decided, a local socialist party decided to hold Women's Day the following year. It was brought before the international organizations at some conventions. And similarly, we see the same tensions within that movement that gets overlooked a lot, where a lot of socialist men did not want to celebrate International Women's Day. Many of them did not want women to be involved in this movement at all, but you had this, but they realized it was just such a great marketing movement for them, particularly as women were starting to get more economic power. They were also starting to get more political power, which is a trend that we see happen over and over again. And in fact, what I find very interesting is Engels, who's probably the greatest popularizer of Marx's ideas. One of the great things that he pushed back upon, one of the horrors of capitalism that he saw, was what he called the unsexing of both men and women, which he believed happened through capitalism. Women were starting to work in factories, and sometimes, horror upon horrors, these women would earn more money than their husbands. They might even be the breadwinners, and these poor put upon husbands were staying home watching children, and he goes on for pages on this point, darning their own socks. And so this is one of the great and terrible things about capitalism that he felt that communism could fix. And so those kind of really not what you would at all consider feminist ideas have always been a part of that socialist movement, have been a part of that communist movement. but it was a great marketing tool. And so, this International Women's Day originally started out as a Socialist Party holiday because of this, as they started to try to draw these new female workers into their ranks. And communist countries then took over, and again, it became a propagandizing tool for the communist state more than it ever did for women's rights. It was the women who are supporting the state, whether it was in China, the USSR, et cetera. And it wasn't until really in about what you might consider the third wave of feminism in the 90s that it started to lose those economic tools and economic tones rather, and become more of a widely celebrated holiday that was really much more central to women's rights specifically. And it's ironic, I think, and a little win that shows you that markets will always come through. You can see all sorts of International Women's Day merchandise, including designer sneakers and purses, things like that are hundreds or thousands of dollars, which is certainly not a great communist win.
No.
But yeah,
it's obviously a sort of free market. I mean, within the free market, if you've got that demand for International Women's Day themed sort of products, and obviously those businesses in the free market will provide for them.
Yes, absolutely. They always will. Yeah, so I think there's been there's this idea that this is fundamentally a communist or a socialist idea, and it's really not. And I think that comes from a few different things. One was that many of the early thinkers who were prolific when it came to women's liberty, women's rights, which includes, for example, we talked about John Stuart Mill earlier, self-identified themselves as socialists, but they were not Marxists, and they did not believe in this government socialism type thing. What they saw as socialism isn't necessarily what we would describe as that. It wasn't so much the economic system as it was this idea of, communities and people helping each other, and these sort of like very nice things that libertarians might describe as civil society, and that we might describe as social change, or even within the marketplace of ideas. So really they were pushing back against what they saw as oppression, much in the same way that I think many modern leftists don't necessarily buy into certain economic calculus. And many of them might even, if you ask them, they wouldn't say that they support North Korea. But right, that's not really what they're thinking about. They just want a world where, people are free, and where people can pursue certain types of freedoms, and it's been sold to them as that's a leftist vision, and it's really not. And I think a lot of that is, that's a failure on our part. That's a failure on people who believe in markets and who believe in economic liberty for far too long have just simply chosen either to not engage in this debate, or for various reasons they don't want to talk about the rights of women, or the rights of other sexual or gender minorities, racial minorities, religious groups. And part of that is because we view ourselves as individualists, and we are individualists, right? And so we say, well, it's about individuals, it's not about groups. But laws do differ based upon groups. People's individual experiences differ based upon groups. Now, that doesn't mean that every, for example, for me, every Indian American woman is going to have the exact same experiences of the world. She's going to have the same ideas. She's going to have the same goals. I mean, obviously that's not true because I'm an individual, but those aspects, the fact that I am a woman, does mean that I will likely see the world in a slightly different way, and the world will see me in a slightly different way than if I were a man. The fact that I'm an Indian American and not just Indian, or not just American, or any of these things, that's also going to influence both the way that the world interacts with me and the parts of the world that I might see, and how I see or interact with the world. And all of those different aspects help build up who we are as individuals. And I think we have to be mindful of that as well. And, you know, when we cede large areas of policy, if we talk about things like, oh, okay, well, you know, women's rights, feminism, that's for the left, it becomes an issue of the left. And it also signals to folks that if you care about those issues, you are on the left. And then, of course, there's some unfortunate tendencies because of this, that, you know, what are really identitarian groups, but identitarian groups for essentially oftentimes white males or things like that, those become more closely aligned with things like capitalism or ideas like capitalism as a response to this, even though many times they don't actually support capitalist values or free market values themselves. And so I think there's a lot of tensions back and forth there. But when you get to the core of these ideas, of these goals, there are no tensions between free market capitalism and women's rights and feminism, because, you know, the long story of women's liberty is in many cases, and perhaps even in most cases, the push for women to be able to access markets equally, because they were not allowed to for most of history in most of the world. And as you mentioned, when women can access these things, we're able to compete at just the same level as men can.
Absolutely. I think that even just talking about property rights, I mean, especially in the United Kingdom, when we had the sort of first sort of women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century, you know, in my view, when we're thinking about the way that property rights have actually impacted women's rights themselves, actually, when women gained those property rights, when women were able to own their own property and inherit it, I think that actually gave them greater social and economic freedom than even suffrage did, because I think it sort of gave them that property rights. I was just sort of going to ask, just touching on this issue as well, a lot of sort of leftist feminists especially will sort of say that capitalism is anti-women. What would your response be to that claim?
I mean, they're wrong.
Yeah.
They're wrong. But, you know, like you mentioned, it depends on what you view as capitalism and why you view it that way. So like you talked about, if you have this idea that capitalism is fundamentally self-ownership, that each individual owns themselves and therefore has the fundamental right to decide with whom they interact, in what ways, and in exchange for what, then capitalism is fundamentally about freedom, and it's about freedom for every individual. And I think that, you know, if you remove that word and just simply talked about those ideas, then many people who might self-identify as being anti-capitalist would actually, many people who might self-identify as being anti-capitalist would actually support what you're saying. But, you know, we've allowed this term, I mean, the very coining of the term, it was coined by Marx, right? And along the way, we've allowed it to be repeatedly colluded with some very anti-free market ideas, right? Even the fact that people might talk about, and a lot of the marketing, a lot of what you might consider the marketing around these ideas has overlooked that as well. Certainly, we have a lot of people, including people who call themselves free market advocates, who say that they're anti-feminist. That's certainly not helpful. You can look at the fact that, you know, fundamentally, what are often held up as examples of free markets or free market capitalism, or people who say that they want to go back to, you know, America's founding, for example. You know, America's founding carried with it this great promise of liberty that was not by any means extended to the vast majority of people within America, you know, whether they were simply not white, whether they're not landed, or whether they were women. And, you know, we talk about this coming from the UK. We talk about this coming first from the UK. We had the common law came to the United States, and under common law, we had this idea of coverture, through which married women did not essentially own themselves, did not have any access to property, could not represent themselves in court. They were a legal fiction. They were a complete legal fiction, and they didn't have any rights to do basic things, and that's carried through for centuries, to be honest. Coverture itself as a whole legal theory was disbanded more than 150 years after America was founded, but some of those ideas were still true all the way up until there's a Supreme Court case in the mid 80s that was overturning laws saying that a husband could remortgage or sell a house that was mutually owned with his wife without her consent or even knowledge, right? So all of those come from these ideas. Those are fundamentally anti-free market, anti-capitalist ideas. The fact that, people were by law not allowed to participate, so many people, that's not capitalism. And I think we just need to be doing a much better job of making that clear to people, that when we're talking about free market capitalism, we are against those things. And we want to make sure that we have a world in which everyone does have access. And, I don't think that we're always doing that so well.
Absolutely. I think just to echo that, a market economy is a market economy where everybody is able to participate, and as individuals we do, and it's essentially the voluntary exchange of those goods and services. So I think defining the free market economy and defining capitalism in that way potentially helps us change the narrative a little bit more. I wanted to talk a bit about the gender pay gap, because I think that this is potentially sort of a hot topic issue that a lot of people tend to talk about. So first of all, do you think that there is a gender pay gap? And if so, why is it happening? Or what is the cause of that? Is it capitalism? Are we all doomed?
Yes. So I think that there is a gender pay gap, and neither the left nor the right is doing a very good job of explaining what it is or why it happens. Because on the left, you have this idea that it's just out and right sexism. People are saying, I'm going to pay women less. And I'm sure that there are people who say that, but that is mostly not what is happening. And on the right, you have, well, it's just a matter of choices. This is not an issue that we should be concerned with. And, again, that gets back to totally seeding the issue. And, that just doesn't work. You're not addressing what's actually happening. And what actually happens with the gender pay gap is, if you look at young, unmarried women without children who live in major cities, oftentimes the gender pay gap reverses. In other words, those women make more than their male peers. But once they get married, once they have children, and if they move away from urban areas, but really those first two things, all of a sudden, their male peers start pulling far ahead. And, that's where you get to the question of people saying, oh, this is just a matter of choice, because they are choosing to get married, they're choosing to have children. And so if they chose not to do those things, then they wouldn't be facing this pay gap. But first off, men are also choosing to get married and choosing to have children, and it's not impacting them in the same way. And then secondly, why is that happening? Well, in part, it's because of many cultural views around who should end up taking over, who should be doing more of the child care when a child is sick, who's going to take off work. And which might be happening within a specific couple, and we see that it does. I'm a millennial, and millennial men increasingly do participate in more of childcare and more of domestic labor than any previous generations, but it's still less than their female peers. And even in couples where you have two, their female partners rather, and even in couples where it's a dual income couple, both couples are making the same income, you still see women overwhelmingly doing more of the childcare and more of the labor at home, the other home labor. And what's really interesting is the more that women make more than their husbands, the more likely they are to do an increased share of both childcare and other domestic labor, and that impacts them, right? But that's happening within the couple. Let me be clear, I do not think that the government should be doing anything to change that. That's about societal roles. I think that those things are changing. That happens in conversations, that is happening through the marketplace of ideas. That's why we're already seeing more equality happening along those lines. But those attitudes, even when they're not within the couple, when they're outside of the couple, it becomes expected in that way. You start getting, women might get mommy tracked or things like that. That's because of expectations of what they might be doing and who's going to be working harder. Men who get married, oftentimes are viewed as more stable, more likely to work hard. And so they're more likely to get those. And again, these are societal conditions, but there are also policies that impact all of this. It might be the tax code, which punishes essentially dual income families and really is set up on purpose in order to incentivize one person to work outside the home and one person to stay home with kids. It might be childcare policies that make it very difficult to get flexible childcare. And a lot of the fixes, the so-called fixes that we're seeing coming, oftentimes from the left now, completely overlook what women say they want, which is more flexibility, more ability to tailor their days towards the fact that they want to be taking care of their families, and they also want to be outside working, and are pushing back against those and making those more difficult so that they fundamentally are not going to be able to do the things that they're already finding are working for them. It has to do with increased regulations along a number of different areas, particularly when it comes to families and having families and things like that. And those are all policy areas where there's a whole lot that free market feminists can do to build a world where we don't have this pay gap, where people of all genders feel more supported in having families. And, that actually doesn't take more government. It mostly takes less. And so I think that, when we sort of write off this issue as, oh, it's about choice, you just miss so much of that picture. And that's just one example of areas where, if we say that feminism is for the left, it does nothing for shrinking the size and scope of government. It does nothing for individuals. And it also, tends to result in these heavy-handed government central policies that don't actually accomplish what we want to see. Another one there is maternity, paternity, parental leave. There's a big push to have government guaranteed parental leave. And, I'm a big fan of parental leave. I think you should have it. And most people feel the same. And that's why we're seeing companies are increasingly competing when it comes to benefits in terms of having better paternity leave, better maternity leave. But when it's government controlled, we actually see that women in countries where there is a generous maternity leave policy, oftentimes, they don't move as far high up in a leadership structure, for example, because that same kind of mommy tracking mentality is happening, where not only are people now thinking, oh, okay, well, if she's getting married and having children, she's not going to be spending as much time at work. They're now also realizing that, okay, well, I'm also by government required to give this that I'm not required to give to a father. So I'm going to make decisions based upon that, which is why we also see the gender pay gap starting to close after women turn age 60. Why? Well, women who turn 60 aren't going to be having any children. So, I mean, there's things like that. And these are difficult policies to work out. When people have tried to say, I used to say like, okay, well, if we had equal maternity and paternity leave, the same length, maybe that would fix the problem. And it really doesn't, because they've done some small studies on this. And for example, in one, they looked at economists, where men and women parents were given equal paternal or equal parental leave. And when this happens, the women who got the parental leave did better than women who didn't get that guaranteed parental leave. But they did worse than men who were not parents. And everybody did worse than men who did get parental leave. Why? Because the women who were getting it were overwhelmingly using it to physically heal from pregnancy and childbirth, and also for taking care of their children, whereas a significant percentage of the men who were getting that parental leave were using it essentially as some extra time to be able to work on more projects. They published more papers, they attended more conferences, which is, of course, not the purpose of parental leave. And that comes back then to these cultural attitudes that need to change, because they weren't looking at it as, this is my time to help with childcare, to help my wife heal from pregnancy and childbirth, which are hugely physically, they have a huge physical component to them as well. And it is a serious medical event for many women. And so I think those things as well. And that's not something you fix with government. That's something you fix by talking to people, by changing societal attitudes.
That is fascinating. I think that is really sort of hitting the nail on the head on the difference between potentially what we might call a leftist feminist, or a feminist Marxist, or a socialist feminist, or a feminist on the left, compared to somebody who is on, on the libertarian sphere when it comes to feminism, because they want to see these changes occur in the social sphere outside of government intervention. So I think that you've sort of hit the nail on the head there, Kat. Thank you. I wonder if you can tell me a bit about the Ladies of Liberty Alliance and the sort of work that you guys do.
Yes, absolutely. So the Ladies of Liberty Alliance is essentially an international nonprofit that's connecting women who are liberty curious or who work in the libertarian movement around the world. It's a professional development organization, networking organization. And I will say, so I've been a member of LOLA since 2012, early 2012, I think, 2011, 2012. And I was reluctant to join at first. I've never liked things that are gender segregated. I was suspicious of the idea of an organization that was just for women. So I wasn't sure about this, but I joined, I went to some meetings, and all of a sudden I realized a couple of things. One was I hadn't realized how frequently I was the only woman in the room until all of a sudden I wasn't. And two, all of a sudden I knew so many incredible women all over the world who were doing amazing things to help spread individual liberty. And I was learning from them. I was learning about the issues in their areas. Again, it's very different how we approach individual liberty in one area versus another, what fights are important, what language is important, what barriers you're pushing back against. But also just like I was making friends with them, and we were talking, this is the other big thing, we were talking about issues differently, because things like, regulations around childbirth and labor and, access to menstrual products and things like that. And talking about it really from this libertarian free market perspective, but those conversations are not going to happen for the most part in a room full of men who really aren't thinking about these issues, because it's not something that matters to them on a day in, day out basis. And so, I'm a big proponent of Lola. I think it's been fantastic. It's great, not just for meeting amazing women, but also, I've made so many friends through the organization, and it's just a great way to just, have that sounding board, like, hey, here's something that I'm running into in my own life. How would you solve this? And these are women who, come from similar mindsets, from very different backgrounds. They're smart, they're very passionate, and it's fantastic what you can do when you have all of these amazing people around you that you're trying to change the world with.
Thank you so much, Kat, for joining me today and having this conversation. I found that absolutely fascinating. That's about all we've got time for today. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. That was a really brilliant conversation. If you would like to support the IEA's digital content, then do consider donating to the IEA's Patreon, the details of which will be in the show notes below. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.